think I'm good to go. I think I'm all there. This is I feel like I need an introduction. I'm Trent Reynolds. This is my weekly live critique broadcast. Um, I start each week at 11 a.m. Los Angeles time, PST or PDT, whatever it is right now. And the idea behind this live broadcast is that um, it's an opportunity for me to see new artwork and well, just basically to respond to artwork. I think, especially in this last year, as we've been more isolated and had less opportunity to interact with other people, it's seemed like um, there's even less opportunity or situations where we can get feedback, especially artists who are making art at home or by themselves in a studio. So part of the idea is that this is a place where you can send images and get feedback. If you want another pair of eyes to look at whether or not your artwork is functioning the way that you would like it to, or just to get new ideas if you feel like you're stuck and having a particular problem, that's what this is meant here to do as well. So if you are interested in participating, if you want me to take a look at your work and critique it, you can send images to me at Dabbleon, that's Dabbleon, at gmail.com, dabbleon at gmail.com, and just send a couple images. And if there's something in particular you want me to address um, or talk about, make sure you say so in the email. Or if you just want me to give you my thoughts without any any specific questions, that's fine too. Um, and I think we all gain inspiration, motivation, and ideas from seeing what everybody else is up to. So ideally, this is work that you're either in progress on, or progress process, works in progress, or recently completed, and that's about it. If you're interested in other art classes or other studio art related content that I'm creating, you can find more out about that at dabbleon.com. That's dabbleon.com. And I've got some announcements hopefully coming very soon about a color class that I'm in the middle of editing, and then also a new podcast which I've recorded a couple episodes for and listened to the edits yesterday, and they sound pretty good. I'm pretty excited about the podcast that's coming out. That's going to be called Raw Materials, and it's going to be conversations with artists about the materials and techniques they use, how and why. So, how materials um, can inspire creativity. Um, so take or keep an eye out for that. I have an email list, so if you go to dabbleon.com, you can also sign up for my email list there. Okay, so without further delay, I did get two images this week that I'm excited to talk about from a good friend. In your email, if you do send images, make sure you tell me whether or not you want me to say your name. I was about to say her name, but she did not give me permission. So um, I would love to also direct people to your Instagram feed or your website if you want. But unless I hear specifically from you, I won't mention your name just to keep it anonymous. All right. So I'm going to check in on Facebook, make sure we got some people in Facebook, and I think my audio is good and going. I think I'm set up right. All right. So I'm going to switch over. Today I'm going to try something a little bit different, and hopefully this works out well. I'm going to try using my iPad instead of Wacom tablet with Photoshop. So Photoshop does offer some, well, I'm more familiar with Photoshop than perhaps using the iPad as a teaching aid. So there's that, um, but the iPad definitely offers some conveniences. Okay, so let's take a look at this. We've got two images today, two paintings. I wasn't told how large these are, but I'm guessing kind of in the neighborhood of 2 by 3 feet, something like that. Medium easel size paintings. And these are the two images that we have. I'm going to talk. I'll just go one by one here. Um, let's see. How do we look up there? So abstract images, fairly geometric, sharp-edged shapes, simple colors. Compositionally, just generally how that foundation that I often talk about. Just looking at it in terms of the foundation. It's a fairly solid foundation. We got grouping of kind of medium-sized objects, fairly low contrast everywhere except for right there in the center, or not right in the center, but right there with that yellow line. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. But generally speaking, this grouping of shapes in relation to the overall format is all right. I don't really take much issue with that. I do like that we have a large shape, medium-sized shape, small shape, really small shape, and then this line is kind of a nice, a finer detail. Um, so there's just, practically speaking, there's a nice amount of variety in how the compositional space is being divided up into smaller shapes. I will probably talk a little bit more about the negative space and how that's being used. I think perhaps there's some recommendations to be made there, but just generally the skeleton of the overall composition is quite nice. It's very good. And then we've got the bulk of these shapes, or the greater mass of those shapes, sitting fairly close, if not. Well, we got this dark line in where that shape is coming pretty close into contact with the edge of the shape. That's sitting pretty close to the third line on the composition. If we were to divide up the composition into, whoops, that's not a very good job. Kind of our rule of thirds grid. I'm not going to be very precise here, but this large vertical shape right there is sitting right there on the left vertical third, which is nice. And then we probably have some other horizontal third divisions happening here, pretty close right here along the line of this right-hand side shape. So activating a fairly interesting geometry, the rule of thirds, or division of thirds, is a good thing. And then also my suspicion is that we've got probably maybe more significantly than the third, we've got a square right there that's being tied into. And let's see if we got perhaps even a square happening on the other side as well, with the kind of joint of that shape right there. So ways that these larger divisions of space are not necessarily being explicitly tied into, but kind of just suggested in terms of where these kind of landmarks are, or changes in direction, or where the shapes are located. So lots of good kind of underlying structure happening there that I think is quite good. In terms of a focal point, right? Where is the primary area of interest? Where does my eye want to go? Is there a conflict between where my eye does go and where I feel like the art is trying to get me to go? I think it's fairly obvious that this line right there, that yellow line, is going to be the dominant focal point. As far as where I go from there, I don't think there's a clear winner. And that's not necessarily a problem, but we do want to talk about legibility. We want to talk about how we get around the whole composition, what visual pathways are being suggested, or how are we guided by the various elements in the composition to go throughout all the different parts of the composition. And in there, I think we could probably, perhaps, there could be some more done with that. So, but there is a clear focal point, um, high contrast there, and then these shapes are palatable. There's nothing. There's nothing too, like demanding about them. There's nothing. They're fairly similar, you know, in the kinds of edges and the kinds of and sizes of shapes that are there. So there's not a whole lot of tension there. It's a fairly relaxed, low energy, contemplative um, piece. There's not many diagonals. This is a diagonal. We've got kind of a little zap of energy, but in the context, the larger context is much more kind of peaceful, right? Horizontal lines, a little bit of a vertical, a couple gentle diagonals, but really not a whole lot of contrast other than that yellow. Okay, so enough said on that. One thing that I wanted to point out here is that this yellow line, which is definitely the focal point, why is that the focal point? Why is that yellow line the focal point? It's being indicated just in terms of how it's overlapping other shapes, that it's in perhaps the foremost shape. It's closest to us, so that's going to be part of what creates a sense of focal point. We see how this shape, for example, overlaps this purple shape in the background, and just how this yellow line kind of extends beyond right there and seems to overlap both the green shape and then this dark blue shape in the background. So there is kind of an implication or a sense of space and overlapping of things in a depth dimension. And suggesting space is a very powerful way to get us involved, to make us feel like we're occupying or believably could occupy the space that these abstract shapes occupy, right? So tying into our sense of space, that's a good thing. But what I wanted to say is like, so this is in the foreground, feels like it's closest to us. The point that I wanted to make here, though, is that it's a really bright saturated yellow. And I think we often think of saturation as being the primary reason that, you know, in this case, that this is a focal point. Whereas I think the bigger deal here, and I think it's worth repeatedly going back and emphasizing this, the bigger deal is not that it's a very saturated yellow next to somewhat complementary colors. We've got a fairly kind of a violet, so close to purple there, which would be the complement of yellow, and then other cool colors that are kind of creating points of contrast. More importantly, there is the, let me do this, is hue saturation. There we go. No, it's not like, let me do that. Aha, that's why. Okay, there we go. So more importantly than this being a saturated yellow, a little zip of saturation, let's take the saturation out of that overall image so we're just dealing with light and dark. And notice that the bigger deal here is value contrast, light and dark contrast. So more powerful than it being a really bright saturated yellow. More importantly, and it's really important to understand this, is value contrast, that it is light. It's not just bright in terms of intense color, it's light surrounded by dark. So there's high value contrast. That is primarily what is bringing out, let's see, that's primarily what's responsible for bringing out that yellow line right there, is value contrast. I mean, it definitely also helps that saturated color is going to be more eye grabbing, and also having it surrounded by complementary colors is also going to create more popping visual pop. But anyway, so value contrast, that's a very good thing. All right, so we've talked about focal point. We've talked about kind of the underlying geometries that are being addressed, where these shapes are located within the overall rectangle, how they're grouped. We're tying into some rule of thirds and squares. Now I'd like to get into just simply or some suggestions here. One would be thinking in terms of unity and variety. The more unity there is, and a synonym for that would be sameness, the more sameness there is, the more boring it is. The more variety there is, or the more sameness, the more boring, but also the more unified, right? The more variety there is, um, the more excitement potentially there is, but also the more chaos there can be. So too much sameness is boring. Too much variety is chaotic and equally kind of opaque and hard to enter and relate to. So they're kind of two sides of the same coin. But we've got to find a balance between those two things, between unity and variety. We don't want too much sameness. We don't want too much variety. We want to find the right balance of both of those. So for me, I find that to be a very helpful way um, of thinking how to just polish and push my compositions. I look for sameness. Where do I see sameness, and how can I introduce some variety? Or on the opposite side of that, if it feels too chaotic or it doesn't feel like it's resolving or coming together, where can I find chaos and reduce it and make more sameness? How can I unify it more? And I think often there's answers in both directions. It's fruitful to kind of think in both directions, which I think is the case here. So just in terms of sameness, I'm looking at this composition and I'm seeing a lot of sameness or similarity in how things are just generally spaced out. So this grouping of objects in relation to the edges of the rectangle of the composition, there is sameness in those dimensions. You're going to find that same kind of dimension in some of these shapes. So look at all these lines that I just made. There's kind of a similarity in all of those, right? This kind of the same width. I'm not talking about the color. I'm talking about that the length of that mark, right? So there's a sameness in the dimension of these different shapes, both in the negative shapes, negative space, and the positive space as well. Right there too. So that's an opportunity to introduce more variety, right? There is also a sameness in the angle. So these diagonals are fairly similar as well. So maybe we can experiment by introducing more variety in the angle of some of those shapes. We do have a little bit of variety in terms of it there being square edges and a round edge, but maybe that could be played with as well. Maybe instead of just square and round, we could also get into more irregular types of edges. But really what I wanted to focus on right here, and I think it would be an excellent place to start, would be just this idea of the similarity a lot of these relationships or these dimensions. So for example, finding somewhere where I could mix that up, I could take, let's try just reducing one of these down significantly so it's a lot smaller. So I'm going to take this background color and make this, maybe I even make it small enough where it goes behind that this green round shape down there, right? So what if I just chop that purple? So now it's actually maybe not that much, because then it starts to kind of tie into the width of the yellow line there. What if I just take it down to kind of somewhere in between those two? And then down here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a more dramatic diagonal, kind of going up there and off. So I'm going to make my brush a little bit bigger to make this go faster. right? So my shape is not nearly as, let me see if I can get that a little bit more precise. So now I've got this purple shape that's quite a bit different in dimension than these other shapes, and now I've got this diagonal happening here, and maybe I emphasize this diagonal a little bit with a straight line, if I can get that to cooperate. Right? I don't know if that's exactly the right idea. Let me see if I can find somewhere else that I might be able to alter that. What if I were to take that same purple shape and bring it all the way off? You know, maybe take this purple, bring it all the way off the edge of the composition, and maybe even a little bit behind that dark shape. Now what's happening here is, I'm going to make it a solid shape so we're not. Now what's happening is this shape is actually dividing up the negative space a little bit more. So we've got kind of this shape and then this negative shape on this other side. That's being divided up by this big purple shape. I'm not super satisfied with that either, though. So let me try one more thing here. What if I were to make this go much more narrow, and I'm going to bring this off the side of the composition. So something like that. Now, that is actually starting to make a little bit of a difference, and I think probably for two reasons. One is that I've got a little bit more variety now in terms of those widths that I was describing with the pink lines earlier, but also right here, notice that point. I'm going to bring this point right here is almost coming in contact with the edge of the composition. You got to be really careful when you have a point of an element of your composition coming into contact with the edge of the composition at a tangent, meaning like right as a point. It's going to draw attention and create tension right at that point of contact, which isn't necessarily a bad thing, but often it creates an unintentional focal point and keeps us kind of going over here instead of spending time on or going to the focal point that we are intended to go to. So my suspicion is that it's probably doing that. It's helping solve that problem, taking away some of that tension, and also dividing up the negative space, creating a little bit more variety in the dimensions of these individual shapes. And maybe let me experiment with one more thing here. What if I kept that center part the same, but made this purple part down here smaller? All right, so if I go, here's the original, and there's the change, the original and the change. I'm going to try to get rid of some of that variation so you can see that. I turn that on and off again. Here's the original and the change. Yep. Why did you come back? All right. So the other thing that I was going to say about this negative space, having this shape right here, this dark kind of blue shape coming off the edge is helping to divide up the negative space a little bit more. I would think that that negative space, let me see. I've got my computer, goodness. All right. I would say that the negative space could be divided up a little bit more, could be used. Um, it's okay as it is. I just think it could be used more effectively. So if you wanted it to stay fairly uniform and not grab our attention much, I think you could leave it almost exactly the same and just very subtly divide it up. So what I mean by that is that you could leave it this same color basically, and maybe just do a slightly different color. So just barely different. A different variation on that, the color that you already have here. And let's see if I can do that a better job of that. I'm going to go on a different layer here. So maybe bring in, how could we kind of accentuate or bring in some more of that movement? All right. So a color very similar to what's already there. I'm going to actually darken that a little bit here, so it's not as different. I'm starting to get a little bit of variation in what was other stuff that was already there. So it doesn't have to be high contrast, right? It doesn't have to be read as a totally different shape. It's just subtly different so that it divides up the negative space into a just so there's more variety there. So it's divided up into more sub shapes instead of it reading kind of like an empty background. Again, you could leave it as it was. It wasn't necessarily, it's not a problem that it's a background. I just think that that background could be used in a very subtle way to create more movement and get us moving around the image more, create more variety, and divide up your composition into sub shapes that just create a little bit more energy. It this is also a matter of personal preferences as well. It would also I mentioned earlier, how do we get from this? Let's see, how do we get from this line right here elsewhere in the image? I start in that line and I kind of follow this line off. Maybe there's a little bit kind of a circulating force happening there. Maybe I might follow this line up here and go over here. But there's, we could use that negative space in the background in a way just to create more visual pathways for us to follow around the image. And that's what I'm talking about, is how can we use every square inch of our composition to create, to make our image more legible, to create more of a visual pathway for the viewer to follow. Okay, so I think that's basically all I have to say. And one last thing I would say about this, and the next one, is that I think in both cases I see a lot of, and this is something that I guess I wanted to spend more time with here before I move on. In the negative space and in some of these shapes, I see a lot of brushstroke texture, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. Brushstroke texture, paint strokes, seeing that the liquid, the visceral quality of paint, the material quality of paint, that's a great thing, right? We love texture, we love that material quality. The when it becomes a problem is when it feels fussy. So, like most things, we don't want the feeling of somebody having to go over and over something, to belabor something, right? There's a kind of tentativeness, a lack of confidence, a lack of directness, that I think just can sometimes be distracting and create a feeling that's counterproductive, that's kind of against the calm that you're creating in the rest of the composition. I feel like some of the brushwork creates an uptightness uh, that works against this mood that you're creating with the rest of the composition. So I think, and again, this is another place where personal preferences will differ. But I think in some of these shapes, at least, probably in the background, I would simplify that brushwork. Right? Maybe you want to keep some of the more kind of fussy or uh, material where you see the texture and you see the pattern, the little patterns of lines created by all that those brush strokes. Maybe you want to keep that in some of the areas to create visual interest, to create a sense of focal point, areas of emphasis where you might want us to spend more time and might want to just emphasize the material quality of the paint. But in areas where you don't want to emphasize as much or grab our attention, I would simplify. So in this background area, for example, bigger brush, more paint. That is the advice that I am finding myself constantly giving in painting classes. Bigger brush, more paint. Use a brush that's appropriate to the size of canvas or the area of canvas that you're trying to address. In this case, my suspicion is that you're working on kind of a 2 by 3 foot painting, and maybe using like a half-inch brush, right? Grab yourself a 2-inch brush. Dump out a bunch of paint, right? Don't dilute it with water, because diluting it with water, you're going to see even more of that fussiness. You're going to see more of the brushstroke texture. Make an opaque layer, grab a bunch of paint, big brush, and where there's 50 brush strokes, go through and just make one. If you need to protect those edges between the shapes in the negative space, put down some masking tape and make a really sharp, clean edge. I feel like the way that the paint is being applied in some of the areas feels more fussy than or fussy, and in a way that contradicts the general mood of the painting. And I think that's also present perhaps in the next one. I don't think you have to get rid of it everywhere, but again, in the places where you want it to be less visually demanding or less visually kind of grabbing, I would simplify, make big, confident brushstrokes, and let these other areas that you want to grab our attention more, or you want to hold on to us more, let them have those kind of fussier, smaller patterns of brushstroke. All right, enough said on that. I think I've made my point. I don't think I really gave you a very good alternative. Some alternatives there. I do like how, I don't know. I was thinking about something earlier, and I'm trying to bring it back up, and I'm not successfully doing that. But you could, I talked about how do you get us from this focal point and then moving around the image. I think there are some ways that you could probably pretty subtly get us. Let's go back here. I'm gonna grab a purple like this kind of. So if you wanted us to move, let's say, this direction more, you could probably grab just a very subtly more saturated blue. I don't know why that little unrounded edge right there is grabbing me in a bad way, but so kind of a more saturated blue, and bring that more saturated blue off to the side there. I'm not sure if that's reading very well, but that would be one way to kind of create a gradation as it's moving over to the side. Or even, you have in your other drawing some more kind of interesting thin line designs happening in the negative space. That could also work. Man, I'm not giving you great ideas here, or I'm not caring much for the alternatives that I'm offering here. Um, or even just like little dots of, I don't know if you want to do that yellow elsewhere, but here I'd be jumping from this yellow over there, and that would get me moving around. What else could be done? You can sometimes the easiest answer or easiest solution is the best solution. Just literally, putting lines in there that move around the image is going to give us a visual pathway, and again, give us a way to enter and move around your composition. I don't think that was the right answer, but anyway, hopefully, hopefully the principles make sense that I'm talking about and give you some ideas on how you might be able to polish that. I would say the same thing. This is the second image that that the artist sent me. I would say the same thing here. Notice up here at the top, this area up here, let me get a better color so you can see what I'm talking about. This area up here at the top, I'm seeing a lot less fussy brushwork up here, which I think is good, right? In this case, I feel like you want that shape, this lighter shape, to kind of recess, push back into space. If there were a lot of really textured brushwork and apparent brushwork, I think it would want to sit more on the surface and would grab our attention more. I think a little bit more of that simplicity could happen in the blue, simplifying some of that. If you want to include some of that, the more textured, smaller, fussier brushwork, I would keep it in this foreground object, which feels like what you want us to spend our time with, and you want to be more emphasized. The concern here, as far as I see it, is creating unintentional focal points, unintentional places where our eye kind of gets hung up or gets attracted to in a way that doesn't feel intentional. The reason it's bad to have unintentional parts of your composition is because it makes it feel like you don't know what you're doing, right? If something feels like it's done unintentionally, even if it's good, that feels like, or it communicates to us that the artist there was a lack of control or knowledge or understanding or expertise or craft or whatever. So unintentional focal points, you gotta be aware of those. And that's why a critique like this or getting somebody else to look at your work and just, start stream of consciousness, trying to point out where their eye goes, can be extremely helpful, because sometimes it's hard to see when we unintentionally or when we create an unintentional focal point. Okay, so I would say the same thing here that I said in the other one. I would be more choose areas to leave that brush texture, and other places come back with a big brush, lots of paint, and just simplify it to make more confident and to decrease the amount of noise or emphasis or distraction from our primary area of emphasis. Okay, one thing that I wanted to do here, I'm going to keep track of the time. I've got too many screens surrounding me. One thing that I wanted to do here, as I did in the other, is see what happens when we take out all the color information. So if I take saturation out and just look at this in terms of light and dark, right? There's a lot of high value contrast going on here. I've got these areas up, these specular highlights. It looks like some kind of vessel that has a top and a handle, and these little spots, the circular spot and then the square spot, these tiny dots, they feel like specular highlights, like really points of high reflectivity, like shininess. So those two dots stand out a lot because they're surrounded by dark values, and they're really light, and they're really small points. Those are going to grab our attention. But also these lines down here that are light values surrounded by dark. So Again, I would want to emphasize here that it's more than the color, more than the saturation contrast. What's primarily really moving us around here, what's really affecting how we travel through this composition is dictated by value contrast more than anything else. Um, I think that is the case here as well because um, there's a lot of complementary colors and they're kind of evenly distributed. Meaning, so we've got red and green, which are complements, and they're kind of over in this region of the composition. We've got yellow and purple, which are complements, and they're over here. And it's interesting how this angle kind of mimics that angle. Huh. And then we've got the orange, yellow, orange of the background, and then the blues in the foreground and in some of these on the vessel. So we've got all of the primary complementary colors. We've got blue and orange. We've got yellow and violet, or yellow and purple, and green and red, and they're all kind of evenly distributed. So that high hue contrast, complementary colors, I don't think is necessarily what is getting us to move around this image. That aspect is kind of evenly distributed across the whole image. All of the colors, I mean, we have some colors that are more saturated than others. This yellow is perhaps a little bit more saturated than the violet, but they're all fairly evenly saturated. They're all fairly highly saturated. This orange in the background is not very saturated, but a lot of saturated color. So again, it's primarily our biggest kind of contrast that's happening here is value contrast. In this image, I don't feel like I have a very singular and strong focal point. I feel like there's a lot of interesting shapes. There's a lot of really intense contrasts and interesting color relationships. Like I said, a lot of complementary colors. But I find myself kind of bouncing around and not exactly knowing where to land. I kind of want to go here to that yellow again. Down here, there's this yellow light value surrounded by a bunch of dark value, and a really bright yellow is going to grab my attention. But then there's these two little specular highlights that are kind of fun and small and kind of interesting details that I want to get involved with. There's not kind of a clear sense of where to start and then how to move throughout. So I think I would spend some time thinking about that. What is of primary importance? Where do you want me to go? And then how do you want me to travel throughout? And then how do you accomplish that? Right. For me, in abstraction, and we all, every artist has a different way of kind of making sense of what they're doing. But for me, I try to come up with some kind of narrative because my mind thinks that way. So coming up with some kind of narrative structure where I think in terms of a main event, like, is it the main event that all of these shapes are kind of coalescing or exploding from, or coming together at a certain point, congregating at a certain point? Is there one place where there is something especially exciting, or that's being framed, like a stage that's being set? I think it just depends on the person as far as how we kind of make sense of how we organize the elements of the composition. Of course, we're also acting just intuitively, right? The problem with intuition is sometimes it doesn't serve us well. Sometimes we have, and I've talked about this before, we have natural default behaviors that are contrary to good, interesting visual design. We have a tendency of wanting to evenly distribute things. We have a tendency to want to make things more systematized and normalized, and that doesn't necessarily make the most interesting visual images. So I would think, I guess that would be my suggestion: is look at this image, and I don't think you need to necessarily change anything or add anything. Well, I guess obviously I'm saying something could be changed, but I would think less in terms of adding stuff and more in terms of just clarifying what you want this to be about. If it helps to think in terms of a story, great. If it helps to think in terms of just um, creating an experience for your viewer, or like an experience, like a walk, like where do you want us to, where do you want us to start on our walk? Where do you want us, what are the features of the walk? What's the, maybe the most dramatic architectural or landmark that, that we're going to. Um, think about how you want to take us through the experience of your painting, um, and the kind of narrative arc of that. Like, there a crescendo? Is there a climax and then a kind of coming back down, or what? Okay, so I want to give you some just kind of like an example of how what I'm talking about here. Um, so let's say I want this yellow to be, you've kind of, to be the main point, and then I want you to follow this kind of pathway, and then there's kind of a circular thing happening here. Maybe what if I could clarify that to some degree, and kind of emphasize the circularity of that happening. Um, this is a new experience. So one thing I might do to refine that is see how I can just tighten up those things so that it falls in line with the momentum that's happening there. So again, there's this line that's happening. So how can I refine those shapes to be more in line with that? If I want this area to be stronger than this area, maybe I could take this yellow and just knock it back a little bit so it's not as dominant as this yellow up there. So make it just a little bit darker, or make this yellow even lighter or more saturated. So I'm going to bring in kind of a sense of three-dimensional space. So if I want this to be the stronger focal point and not to be not as much competition with other elements, how do I emphasize this and de-emphasize other things? If I want people to go from this up, say, to this red area, maybe I could put a little bit of a highlight or more saturation right up here. And how's that reading on the... So people now go from this yellow and go up here to this red, follow it around on the lid, and then maybe pick up this line down here at the bottom, and maybe I bring some of that yellow back over on this side, so it kind of gradates into that lighter yellow to bring me back to this yellow right there. So now there's more kind of this circular thing happening. I go here first, I move up into this red, I follow these two little specular highlights, I follow this pathway around, it brings me down here to this bottom edge yellow, and then that gradates from a dark yellow into a lighter yellow that brings me back to the circle, right? And I kind of go in that circular path. Maybe Maybe emphasizing this green, making it a little bit lighter in value. Ooh, that's really lighter in value. Or more saturated. Making this green a little bit more saturated. Maybe bringing that green. What if I brought the green in front of that line? Maybe not. I don't know. That might help us kind of follow this red down into the green, but then it gets disrupted by that line. Yeah, I don't know. If you wanted us to come out over to this edge, be careful again. You've got that kind of tangent, this point coming into contact or coming close into contact with the edge of the composition that can be a bit distracting. All right. So I think I've made my point there. Let's do an on and off. Okay, so this is before the original, and this is after. I'm kind of making it more three-dimensional, and I suspect that you're after more of kind of flat shapes, which is fine too. But again, finding ways to take what's already there. I don't think you need to necessarily add much more. Take what's already there and just refine. How can you emphasize some areas and de-emphasize others to start making it feel like it's just to feel like there's a progression. There's a starting point, and then we're working or following a visual pathway. Right now, it feels like everything, all this, the emphasis, right? The emphasis, what's being emphasized, they're kind of evenly distributed, and there's no one clear place to start and then way to follow that around. Okay. The other thing that I would point out here is similar to what I said in the last one, and that is I think it's a fruitful, a useful way to think of it. Wherever there's sameness, there's an opportunity to introduce a little bit more variety, and vice versa. I already talked about kind of simplifying some of the brushwork, but we do have, going through just like I did the last one, let me go back here, there are some similarities in just the dimensions of the various shapes in here. So how can we just introduce more variety in terms of making some of those shapes much bigger, making some much smaller, so that consistency, that sameness gets broken up, and there's a little bit more contrast in terms of the dimensions of the shapes, or dimensions of the sizes of the different elements of your composition. Okay. So that is the last thing that I'm going to say about this one. I do like this, and I think a potentially fruitful thing to follow is this combination of these really kind of delicate lines kind of swirling around or traveling around these geometric kind of solid sharp-edged shapes. I think that's a really nice tension between those two, a nice graphic element. You do have, I think one more thing that's kind of along the same lines of what I'm talking about is you do have this sense of space where you have the blue line that's overlapping the red lid right here, but over here it's going behind the lid. So, and then over here it's going behind here, but then this one's in front. So there are some spatial inconsistencies, or maybe they're not inconsistent, but it's not very clear. And that can be, again, it can be a good thing, but it can also be a bad thing, where our brain is trying to understand how these objects are relating to each other in this illusionistic space that you're creating. We're trying to kind of wrap our minds around the logic of this image and how these things are relating to each other, and then relating that to us and how we as the viewer interact with these objects, right? If we are meant to occupy the same illusionistic space, or if there is something surreal happening in in terms of those special relationships. That can be both a good thing because it can challenge the viewer, but it can also just create this low grade dissonance that maybe you want, maybe you don't want, right? It kind of depends on, again, this the mood that you're trying to set, what it is you're trying to communicate. Um, so I'm gonna switch over here. Um, so that was an interesting attempt using this iPad. It actually in a lot of ways was a more comfortable tool to use for this, a little bit more direct in my ability to manipulate the image, but also was was a little bit new, so kind of hard for me to think clearly and speak clearly, and also practice with a new tool. Anyway, hopefully I gave you some ideas on how you might be able to push these compositions forward a little bit, and give you a better idea of how they're being read, what's succeeding, what could use some more help. But overall, I think they're great. I enjoy the simple geometric composition. I enjoy the shapes. There's personality in there. There's a quirkiness in the choice of palette, and there's, I don't know, there's a friendliness to the shapes and the way they're composed and organized in the rectangle. So really good work, and thanks for sending it in. It was a lot of fun to talk about them and a lot of fun to look at them. And for me, with a lot of these paintings that are being sent in, they're also people that I know, that I've worked with in the past. So of course, it's always just really satisfying to me to see friends out there making artwork, and to get the chance to see what you've been up to, and that you are continuing to create. So well done on that front as well. I think that's it for today. I've droned on enough about this stuff. But a reminder, if you would like me to respond to your work in critique on this live broadcast, send me images at dabbleon, DABBLEON, at gmail.com. And if there's something specific you would like me to address, something that you're struggling with, or a question that you have, and it could be a question about materials, just logistics of how to apply paint, for example, that you're struggling with or wondering about, or it could be something having to do just visual design, how the composition is working. If there's something specific you want me to talk about, let me know in the email. And that is it for today. I'm off to the studio. It's kind of exciting today. We've got a new wall going up that's going to give me a little bit more space to work with, so I'm kind of excited about that. And I think with that, I will say goodbye and wish you all a happy week. And we'll see you next week on Thursday at 11 a.m. Los Angeles time. Take care. Go make some artwork and send it to me so I can see it. All right. Bye-bye, everybody. I'll take a look at the Facebook comments. Thanks for all of you that are listening live. It makes a big difference to me to know that you're out there watching. All right. See you next time. Bye-bye.